Hello, 7th graders. Tonight's homework, we're talking about the Middle Ages in Europe, and we're talking about the groups of outsiders that invaded the Middle Ages. Some things you might be familiar with from the Middle Ages are kings and queens, and as you know, when a king or queen is in charge, we call that system of government a monarchy. You should also be familiar with castles, which were used to defend a kingdom when it was invaded. And you should also be able to be familiar with knights, because let's face it, kings and queens are not doing their own fighting. They rely on soldiers to do it, and these are the knights that kind of became famous during the Middle Ages. Now, this next map is modern-day Europe. It shows all of the large countries that are in Europe today. There are some larger countries. There are also some smaller countries. But things looked a lot different 1,000 years ago. You didn't see big countries like Poland and Germany and France. What you had was many, many little itty-bitty kingdoms. So this map is transforming into the way that Europe looked during the Middle Ages. And let's look at that one more time. Focus on the United Kingdom. It's a big country today. And this is what it looked like during the Middle Ages. It's very small. It's splintered and fractured up between many different kingdoms. And these kingdoms, they were happy being small. They were happy just competing against each other for land and resources because they didn't know any different. But then invasions, waves of invaders started showing up along their coasts, and they realized they needed to find a way to get bigger and stronger so they could protect their land. This map is a geographical map. You see all of these little rivers and green areas here on Europe, lots of rich farmland. You also see some dark brown mountainous areas. And this map might look very familiar to you because it is the background for our word splash. Don't worry, we're not studying all of the words today. We're just going to focus on the 4 invading groups during the Middle Ages. And they were the Vikings, the Mongols, the Magyars, and the Moors. And you're looking at the word splash, which reminds me that it's time on your foldable to record the words that we have in the English language today that came to us. We assimilated them from those invasionary groups. So if you could please copy down the 3 words in each box onto your foldable, that would be wonderful. I'll give you time to do that. Go ahead and pause me. And moving back to our word splash, let's get rid of all the words we don't need and just focus on the ones that we do. So there we have the Vikings, the Magyars, the Mongols, and the Moors with a picture of each one. And I gave you a handout today that had those same 4 pictures on there. Please cut them out and place them on the front doors of your foldable. Please make sure you color the Viking before you cut them out. It'll be a little bit easier. So go ahead and pause me, and you'll have time to do that. All right, step 3, we're going to take some notes in each of these information boxes. To have your foldable completed, you need to have 3 facts written down in each box. Okay? One of those facts that you have to make sure you have is that one of your facts is the homeland for each of the groups. Okay? So I'm going to tell you where these groups originated before they invaded Europe, and you need to make sure you record that. The other 2 facts, you can write down anything that strikes your fancy. Let's start off with the Vikings. Their homeland is up here in the north. It's called the Scandinavian Peninsula. It's a very cold place, a high northern latitude. They have long winters and short summers, which means their farmers don't have a lot of time to grow crops. So the Vikings began invading other parts of Europe in order to steal food. But over time, they began to steal other things like gold and silver, women, all kinds of things. And one of the things that allowed them to invade easily and quickly was called the Viking longship. And it was big enough that they could sail the open seas. They could sail around the Atlantic. In fact, there's archaeological evidence that shows the Vikings reached the Americas before Columbus did. But a cool thing about this ship, it could also sail up rivers because it had all of these, it had a room for about 40 men, and each one would have an oar, so they could provide manpower to fight the current. And the bottom of the boat, which is called a keel, it was very flat on the bottom. So Viking ships could sail in water that was only 4 feet deep. So that means they could go way upstream on these rivers and attack inland cities and villages. The next group are the Mongols. They originated in Mongolia. That was their homeland. Today, Mongolia is in between Russia and China. But back at the beginning of the Middle Ages and during the Roman Empire, the Mongols were becoming stronger and stronger and more powerful. And they moved throughout Asia and across Russia until they reached Europe. And when they got there, the Europeans had never seen anything like it. Check out all the armor on the horse and the rider. What does that remind you of? It reminds me of a knight. And once the Europeans had to start fighting armored soldiers and horses like the Mongols had, they realized that they needed to step up and match that somehow, and that's where we got our knights from. All right, the third group is the Muslims. As you recall, they took over northern Africa. That was their homeland. But then they moved across this narrow strip of water called the Strait of Gibraltar and invaded Spain and Portugal. And they took over that territory and kept it for over 200 years. Now, the king of Spain didn't like it, but he was too weak to repel this invasion. Now, the Moors, they saw how easy it was to beat the Spaniards, and they decided to move through northern Spain and try to invade France. And the French king, he just heard about how the Moors were kicking tail and taking names, and he was not willing to go raise an army and defend his kingdom against the Moors. So instead of the king defending the kingdom, it fell to the local mayor. That's right, the mayor had to raise an army and go fight against the Moors. Now, luckily for the Franks, their mayor was Charles Martel, and his nickname was the Hammer. And in the year 732, at the Battle of Tours, he dropped the hammer on the Moors and kicked them back into southern Spain and Portugal. And that brings us to our final, certainly last but certainly not least, invasionary force. It was called the Magyars. And if you remember Rome, when we talked about Rome earlier this year, there was a homeless tribe that laid siege to Rome. They wanted land, but when the Romans wouldn't give them land, instead they took all the gold, and they were called the Visigoths. Now the Visigoths took that gold, and they moved over into Eastern Europe, where they began to assimilate with the other tribes that lived in that area, and they found their homeland. They were happy, and this new culture that arose from all of these tribes intermarrying were called the Magyars, and the Magyars were the new Visigoths. They were the descendants of the Visigoths, and they had a homeland, and they were happy until the Mongols showed up, and the Mongols were just too much for the Magyars to handle. They kicked the Magyars out of their new homeland, and the Magyars had to wander around Europe, attacking people, trying to find a new place to live. So, as you can see, Europe had problems. Vikings invading from the north, the Mongols and the Magyars invading from the east, and you had the Moors coming up from the south. They had to figure out a new social structure that would help them protect their land, and they came up with feudalism. So we will talk more about feudalism another day. It's time for your final step on your foldable. What I want you to do is color in the area of Europe where these invaders color in their homeland. So this is the Vikings homeland up here on the Scandinavian peninsula, and then draw arrows to show where they went when they were invading and going on a conquest to take things. So these arrows show all of the different points where the Vikings invaded. Please do the same thing for the Moors. Please do the same thing for the Magyars. The Mongols is a little bit different. You cannot see their homeland because the map isn't big enough. So all you have to do is show their army coming out of Russia and invading all along Eastern Europe. Make sure you have your foldable completed. Bring it with you to the beginning of class tomorrow so you can participate in tomorrow's activity. Have a wonderful evening. Goodbye.